And then just to give you an idea about this bus, notice that one of the components of the ICFM, IBM Counter Fraud Management System, is the IBM Integration Bus, which was, as we've said before, formerly known as the WebSphere Message Broker. And what it is an IBM's integration broker. And it's called integration because, remember, it's doing essentially a lot of this translating between the various systems, their various applications. It's the integration broker from the WebSphere product family that allows business information to flow between disparate applications, like we've been talking about, across multiple hardware and software platforms. Rules can be applied to the data flowing through the message broker to route and transform the information. The product is an Enterprise Service Bus, something we've also discussed, ESB, supplying a communication channel between applications. Okay, so what does that look like? Well, I know these are very fuzzy. We'll cover this in more detail in clearer images later, but this is essentially an image of the integration bus. And this is really what it looks like when you're using it. You will see in the toolkit, we'll also cover these things later, but essentially this is what it's going to look like. And it's very similar to what we've been talking about, which is basically a bus. And the question is, well, what is a bus? Well, a bus is something that we're all actually very familiar with. When you open up a computer, even if you've never opened up a computer, you probably have already seen something that looks like this. You have these slots and you have these sort of lines connecting the different areas of the computer. If you abstract it out a little bit, it's going to look something like this. And a bus is really nothing more than something that connects, and something we've already talked about, right? These channels, or in the case of an entity relationship model, the links between the different components. So that's really all a bus is. It's just these things connecting all of the different areas together. So you have memory bus to the memory, right? You have AGP bus to the AGP, you have front side bus to the front side components, the PCI bus to the PCI components, and so on. Now, of course, in our sort of application, you're not going to have AGP, and I'm not going to be a CPU here. You're going to have applications. This will be an application. This is an application. This is an application, and so on. And that's what the bus is attempting to do. Connect all of these various components and allow any translation if needed at the various component levels. Or instead of levels, endpoints, of course, like we've been discussing. So these endpoints expose a set of inputs and outputs, including connection protocols such as WebSphere MQ, TCP/IP, and of course remember that WebSphere MQ is really just using TCP/IP, but it is kind of the glue. It is this bus that is connecting us to the MQ and getting us around to our different applications. And then as another practical example, do you remember we had talked earlier about the IBM Knowledge Center? Well, here, if you go look at the IBM Counter Fraud Management ICFM deployment topology, and you look at this diagram, well, notice that we have the core server, the analytics server, and the data server. But you have to imagine, these are actually VMs. So you have really VM1, VM2, VM3, and then potentially, and actually pretty likely, VM4, and then also VM5. Well, look specifically here at the analytics server where you see the SPSS modeler at premium server. Well, we had said before that if you are trying to integrate multiple products, and that it's that if you had a mainframe here and that was supposed to connect over to some new project that you were working on, well, we really don't have to say mainframe anymore. We really can now say, because we're looking at ICFM, we can say SPSS. Because, and this doesn't have to be some specific project, this could be DB2. And of course you're wondering, well, maybe you're wondering, but you have ICFM here in the middle, right? Well, sort of. ICFM is actually a collection of all of these products. We had said earlier that MOM is really a way to take disparate products and then make them work as a single application. So you can sort of consider this whole thing here as ICFM, and that you're going to be sending messages back and forth across to these systems here like that. And if you're going to do that, again, you don't have to think of this SPSS as a mainframe, this box as a mainframe. It can be SPSS, and in fact it is. And this is a very common sort of thing, right? So you're going to take some sort of, there could be, for example, let's say you go into the web page of ICFM and you tell it, okay, I want to run a statistical analysis on something. Let's just call it A, right? And what will happen is this A is going to, we'll see how later, this is going to trigger SPSS to do a statistical analysis of A, and it's going to spit out results. We had said earlier, right, that we have these inputs and we have these outputs, and DB2, of course, obviously has its own inputs and its own outputs. So you can see where this is going, right? You're essentially, and this is going to have its inputs and its own outputs. So you can see, right, we're saying, okay, well, the input is going to be the user who's out here, somewhere working, and he says, I want to do whatever he wants to do, run A, and then the output is, okay, well, fine, let's send that off to SPSS. SPSS does its number crunching, and then it has its output, and it sends that off to DB2 for input. And then as output, you would see something like, yes, that worked just fine. And now you have, you can sort of see this flow. And indeed, this is actually called, this of course is still ICFM, but this whole moving around of all of these messages, because remember, these are all messages that are being passed back and forth. This whole sort of thing is called a flow. And we're going to see later that in ICFM, this is indeed the name of it as well. So if you look at WebSphere Message Broker, from this book, the WebSphere Message Broker Basics. This book was written in 2005, so you have to sort of take this with a grain of salt and use it mostly for the theory, because and even there, really just the first couple of chapters probably, because so much has changed since then. But still, the theory itself hasn't changed, and that's important. And this is a good explanation of it. Basically, the point here is that if you look at what this is, it's WebSphere Message Broker. Remember, that's been renamed to IIB, or IBM Integration Bus. Is a powerful information broker that allows both business data and information in the form of messages to flow between disparate applications and across multiple hardware and software platforms. We know all this. We've talked about all this, but business rules can be applied to the data that is flowing through the message broker in order to route, we've talked about that, store, it's the DB2, retrieve DB2, and transform the information. This doesn't have to be DB2, but transform, right? So we've talked about that as translation. Well, how does that happen? Well, we just looked at part of it. That happens through a flow. What is a flow? WebSphere Message Broker, or IIB, is used in the implementation of an application integration architecture because it provides a mechanism for connecting, routing, and transforming, just like we saw, with a variety of transports without any need to change the underlying applications generating the data. WebSphere Message Broker enhances the flow and distribution of information by enabling the transformation and intelligent routing of messages without the need to change the applications. Things we've already talked about. The point is that when a message moves from one point to another point, it is creating what is called a flow. And that is exactly what we looked at here. Information sort of started here, and it's sort of flowing through these inputs and these outputs, and then eventually into wherever it needs to finally land.